Today we have Dr. Jake Maurer here. He is the State Extension Soil Specialist, and he is going to talk about soil sampling.
Soil sampling is a very important part of the soil testing process. We're going to take a minute to look at some of the soil testing tools that one might use to do that. This is a common, simple soil sampling probe. It's 15 inches deep from here to here. Requires a lot of bending over. If you're going to composite a lot of samples in the field, expect to bend over. But we've got a slightly fancier instrument called the back saver. You can step on the pogo stick like steps here and press it into the ground, and you may pull it back up, and it saves a lot of bending over in the field. So these are two tools that professional soil scientists use quite a bit. Another one here is the soil bucket auger. This takes a good bit more effort to get into the soil, but it takes a good sample as well. Of course, if you don't want to invest the money in these professional tools that scientists use, and you don't need to, you can just get a simple simple shovel from one of the garden centers or the hardware store. Although I would recommend a sharpshooter because it doesn't require as much soil each shovelful to get a soil sample. All right, next we're going to go out into the field and show you how to use these. Now, when soil sampling out in the field, there are a few things you need to understand. A single sample does not represent the field, right? So we have to take composite samples. And we have to do that to even out the random variation in the soil across a field. Okay, so at Texas A&M we recommend 10 to 15 samples represent 20 acres. If this is a pasture situation, then maybe we would have 15 to 20 samples represent 45 to 60 acres. Okay, we composite them in a bucket and mix them up real good and put them in the soil sample bag. So these are some of the tools that we saw earlier. This is a simple hand probe. Use it this way, press into the soil, give it a nice twist, lift up with the legs, and you get a soil sample. What's really important here is that a soil sample doesn't represent an acre, okay? An acre is an area. A soil sample represents a volume of soil. So at Texas A&M we recommend that you take a soil sample to 6 inches. So you need to measure it. You can use a tape measure, one of these, or you can do what Dr. Jake does and get a free paint stick from the hardware store, mark 6 inches off on that. Then you don't have to pull your tape out and put it back every time. Okay, we got 6 inches there. Can mark the end of that core. And then, if you'll follow me, I'm going to get a bucket. Dump that into the bucket, and then we discard all the soil that was from more than 6 inches deep. Okay, and that's how we'd use this particular probe. The back saver works very similarly. However, we get to use the pogo stick action. Again, lifting with the legs, we get a nice looking core. Still, we need to be careful that this core is only 6 inches deep. And we can put that in the bucket. And then, if you happen to have a sharpshooter laying around the house, you need to do this a little bit differently. We recommend that you insert the shovel into the soil to at least 6 inches deep. Once, and then a second time to take a slice out of the soil. So we wind up with something like this, okay? If we take 15 to 20 of these, we're going to have a very heavy bucket. It may be worth your while to invest in a soil probe. last step to soil sampling in the field is to mix your soil cores. We'll do this with a trowel. Now it's important to remember that you want to label your soil bag before you fill it. I always forget, and so I wind up riding on a lumpy bag, which makes it look like I have shaky hands. But if you label first, then you don't have that problem. So you break up your soil cores, then you fill the bag to the fill line. At this point, it's okay to discard the excess soil. You have composited your field, overcoming random variability. You have filled to the fill line. Turn your tab over 3 times. Bend the tabs over. Send it to the lab.
Today we are here with Dr. Becky Grubbs, the State Turf Extension Specialist. We're at the Scott's Miracle-Gro Turfgrass facility, and she's going to talk to us about how to take a soil sample in a lawn area.
All right, so in order to get the best feel for what's going on across the entire area of the lawn, we're going to want to take 15 to 20 samples throughout the area. You could do this for both the front and backyard if you have both of those, or you could do it for the front yard and for the backyard separately, just realizing that if you do that and you get those soil test results, you'll probably have to manage those areas differently. So when we get ready to go into the soil, we're going to want to go to a depth of about 4 to 6 inches. And this is our rooting depth of the turf, so that's why we go that deep. We want to know what's going on in the soil around our roots. So we just irrigated this area this morning. It's a little bit softer because of that. That helps us pull the sample out. So here you can see this is a depth of about 4 inches here. We'll take that, we'll move it into the bucket. So if you don't have a soil probe at home, you can also do this with a hand trowel or a shovel. It can be a little bit more difficult with a turf grass area like this, just because the canopy tends to become very dense. These typically cost about $25 to $50 a piece. So if you think that you'll be sampling on a regular basis, annually or even semi-annually, it may be worth the investment, or maybe get with your neighbors, see if you guys want to pool together. So one thing that you may have noticed when you were collecting your samples was that it may have been harder to take samples in some parts of the yard relative to others. This could be due to differences in your soil texture, but it could also be due to the fact that your irrigation system is not working uniformly. So if you did irrigate the morning that you sampled, you went out, you noticed that some areas were a lot harder than others, it may be time to also look at getting an irrigation audit. So before we move the soil into the bag, we're going to want to go ahead and mix it together. Like I said, we collected multiple soil samples in order to make sure that we got a good feel for the average across the entire area. So mixing the soil is one way for us to make sure that we get that average. Then we'll move it into the bag. We'll make sure that we label our bag correctly, fill out the proper form before we send it off to the soil testing lab.
All right, we're at the George Bush Library, and we're going to use this as an example of how to take a soil sample in a garden setting. And so if you notice in a garden, and especially here, you have different zones. You have a turf zone, you have this bed that extends down, then you have another bed. You might even have beds that have different plants in it. Maybe one bed is roses, another bed is just some flowers, another bed maybe shrubs. And so you may want to manage these different zones differently. So the idea is that you take samples from the zones that you want to manage individually, then you send that soil sample out and they will tell you how to manage that particular zone. So the other thing that you need to be aware of is that a lot of times in garden settings, there's a lot of mulch or organic materials on the top. You really don't want that as part of your soil sample. You really want to take the soil, not so much the covering on top. And if you're doing this for your soil sample, for your class, we absolutely do not want a lot of organic materials or potting soil or things like that, because that's not really true soil. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to uncover down to where it's getting to where it's about soil. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this. Now, lawn samples and field samples may be really hard to press in, especially if it's dry. Garden samples are usually a lot easier. And so we're going to just push this in lightly and pull it out. And you can see I got a really nice deep soil core. So how much do you need, right? You can, and here you can really see a nice profile. You see a lot of the organic matter at the surface, and then we're getting into the real soil. What I would really like to get is the top 6 inches. It really depends a little bit on the type of plants you're growing. If you're growing impatiens and smaller flowers, maybe you only need 4 to 6 inches. If you're growing bigger shrubs, you might want deeper, but 6 inches is kind of a good rule of thumb. So I'm going to take this. I have a little measuring thing on the bottom, and I'm going to take this part and put this in my bucket. And that is our soil sample for the garden. So we'll take, because this bed is fairly large, we're going to go ahead and take about 15 samples out of this and combine them together, mix them well, and then we can put them in the soil sampling bag. And that will be the soil sample for this flower bed. Now we've collected our 15 samples. We want to go through and make sure we break up all of these little clods that are still left over. We want to make sure we break it all up. And that way, if you don't take the whole bag, it's okay because you've mixed it up. I mean, if you have more soil that won't fill in your bag, that's okay. And once we get this all kind of mixed up, we'll put it in the bag. And again, I don't know if you noticed, but a couple of those soil samples, they didn't go in quite as far as others. And again, that can indicate differences in depths in your bed. It can maybe indicate poor irrigation practices, or it just may indicate different layers of mulch, so and how much that mulch has been repeatedly applied and accumulating. So it kind of can help you. Taking a soil sample can also help you with your management a little bit. All right, so now we have our soil in our bag. We can roll it up, make sure it's labeled appropriately, and then this can be sent off to the soil testing lab for your sample.